Okay, welcome. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Lynn O'Hara from National History Day, and we are thrilled to be joining you for the fourth webinar in our Untold Stories of the Korean War Silent Hero program. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on the Korean War veteran experience. And as always, we are very appreciative to Dr. Lesh Melnick and the team at the National Cemetery Administration, who not only has supported the program financially, but I have to say they have gone above and beyond. They are answering history questions and searching down mysteries and helping us find people on transport lists. And I have to tell you, in working with lots of different programs, not every program officer goes out of their way to be helpful to participants. And I have to be incredibly grateful for Dr. Melnick and his team for stepping up with every question we've asked. All right, let's talk about where we're at and where we're going. This is kind of a nice transition point. So, all right, first off, the easy housekeeping stuff. You know, you've got the Q&A box. Send us questions. If you've got a burning question that you want to get asked, get it in this queue before you forget, and we will answer it tonight. You also have live captioning. If you don't want it, hit the live CC button. You can turn it off. We'll post the slides, we'll post the video tomorrow to Google Classroom. Just look for the tab that says webinar for materials, it'll all be there. I know you're wrapping towards your assignment, which is your military experience organizers. They're due on Friday. Please remember to hit that mark as done button, teachers. That lets your research mentors know you're good to go. When I checked yesterday, we were more than half in getting our cemetery visits scheduled. And so we're excited to see this. Once we get those dates, that's going to put some things in motion from our end. And we'll be sharing that to see if there's any visitors who might be able to join you. I know many of you have been working with my colleague, Jamie Hollyfield. Please reach out to her if you have questions, need help, or are running into roadblocks and getting in touch with certain people. Module 6 is live. Now, this is something that I've been working on and picking out for the last 4 weeks. So I'm excited to make it live yesterday. Really quickly, before we jump into our content tonight, I just want to take a couple minutes and go over what comes next. So that creation phase that we were talking about. Essentially, Module 6 goes from this Friday to the end of April. It's one big module, but like anything with any kind of project-based learning, we've broken it up into manageable stages. So I want you to think of this as 6 steps to the end. First step, now that your research is over, is to submit the draft of your eulogy. So your draft is going to come in a written form. And we have just dropped guides to help you do that. Teachers, take a look at that. We have video examples and textual examples to help you guide your students to a short, compact piece of writing. Like anything in writing, we all need to make a draft and then we all need to get some feedback. So the goal is by Monday, February 3rd, you've got between now and then to submit your eulogy drafts. We've got folders in your Silent Hero folders that have the instructions and the file to put your text directly in. What we're going to say is that everybody who turns in a draft by February 3rd will get feedback from somebody on the project team no later than Monday, February 10th, so within a week. What then you do is once you get through stage 1, we move to stage 2. In stage 2, we make any revisions we need, maybe fill in any gaps or tighten up any wording or, make sure we write in past tense, because remember, history already happened. From there, the next step is we're going to ask you to make an audio recording of the eulogy and upload that into the eulogy folder. We've got some directions in Google Classroom how to do this. Now remember, this doesn't have to be a perfect audio recording. We have all done some audio work, and one thing I can tell you, if you are reading a sentence and maybe you flub up the word in the middle, that's okay. Stop, pause, go back to the beginning of the sentence, start reading again. Our videographer, Chris Preparato, will do some amazing work and edit out any blips. Trust me, he makes all of us look good on camera. But those audio recordings are due by February 24th, and that's important. We know that's before most of you will ever go to your cemetery visits. But what that allows is for our team to start working on the video eulogies by using that audio track. And then we can add in film from the cemetery. That also makes sure we have a clear audio track if, I don't know, maybe the day you visit the cemetery, it's very windy, or the team might be cutting the grass or some other noise, there's a helicopter above, things that we just can't control. So that's stage two. So stage one, write the eulogy, revise it. Stage two, record it. Stage three is a big one, and this goes from now until March 3rd. Your job is to write a rough draft of your profile. In your folders, we've got templates and instructions. We also have a video that will walk you through exactly how to do that. This is where you give us all of the raw items, the text of their story, the images or documents that go with it, and everybody's favorite part, your bibliography. Here's the thing though, this might look intimidating or scary, but you have done 95% of the work for this already. You've done the research. Now it's time to write it up. Same thing we're going to do here. You turn in a draft by March 3rd, you will get feedback by March 12th. Again, if you get a little ahead of things, teacher, that's great. You let us know, teachers. We'll get in and get you some feedback early to keep you going. From there, we use the rest of March to clean up anything that's left out. Maybe we need to add a little bit in this section or add a couple sources. We make sure everything's in there. In early April, you'll submit your teacher post assessments and your student post assessments and the teacher evaluation form. We'll make those live a little later. They're not live just yet, and that's intentional, right? We got to get all the way through the program before we can make those live. And then by the end of April, you'll have completed your cemetery visit and uploaded any multimedia, so any photographs or videos from your visit to your folder. Once we get through all of those stages, then we'll complete out the projects. Teachers, you'll get the second part of your stipends. And then our team really kicks into gear, making the edits and then getting the videos made. Remember, we're going to do 50 videos out of the 100 veterans. And then we're also going to get these profiles posted both to the Veterans Legacy Memorial site and to NHD Silent Heroes. So that'll be on a rolling basis. Once you've got drafts up, we'll send you a note. You can check everything out, make sure it looks good. And then we'll be rolling these out and announcing these, quite frankly, through the spring and in through the summer. So all of them will be up and finished by the end of August. Now, it sounds like a lot, but I'm going to encourage you to take it one step at a time. Finish up your military experience organizers and move into writing the eulogies. This is our last live program, but don't worry about it. We are posting January virtual office hours. We'll also post some in February and March and the beginning of April as well. But we're going to post times where our team is definitely available. So the first two, January 24th, January 29th. So 4 to 5 p.m. on the 24th, 4 to 5:30 on the 29th. If you have questions, want to pop in, want us to look at something, come on down. If you're looking at this going, well, but my group meets on Tuesday afternoons and we're out in Mountain Time Zone, that's okay. Send us a note, give us days and times, give us time zones. I will promise you that we will get at least one of our team members on the call. Between our research mentors and our NHD team, we've got lots of people who are more than happy to hop in and help you out. All the links for these are on Google Classroom. Now, I know that's a lot of info. I put a copy of this slide at the end, so if we have questions in Q&A, we can easily go back to it. But that's enough announcements and information from now. Our focus tonight is going to be looking at life after the war, and for most of our veterans after their military service, because I think this is a very unique war when we look at the history of 20th century warfare. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Hamner to tell us more about that.
Thank you so much, Ms. O'Hara. Can you confirm that my slides are visible on screen? Fantastic.
Sure.
Thank you all so much for taking time out of this early week in 2025 to join us. Thank you again to Dr. Melnick and to the NCA for the incredible support. We're just really excited to be working on this project. And depending on where you are, this might be a good night to be sitting in around a webinar. I am back in Washington, D.C. We are looking at single-digit temperatures next week. As my advisor said, this is good history weather. So a quick link back to what we talked about in our previous webinar, which talked a little bit about Cold War context and the sort of reasons for the war in Korea. We talked a little bit about the operational history of the war and the sort of movement back and forth, north and south along the Korean Peninsula. But most importantly, I think most interestingly for this project, we talked a lot about the actual soldiers' lived experience on the front line, from the cold and misery of the conditions to the difficulty of the actual combat. And that's, I think, the heart and soul of this project. And tonight we're going to move things just a little beyond the battlefield. We're going to follow some of these soldiers back into the civilian life that they rejoined after the war. I always like to break things into threes. So tonight's three things, we'll start with a kind of consideration of the way that Americans, particularly civilians at home, thought and understood what was happening in the Korean conflict. And here I found it really useful to contrast the experience of living through the Korean War as an American civilian versus the experience of living through the Second World War. And in part, I think those contrasts help illuminate some really useful and important things for us. But the thing that first got my attention was digging through primary sources from 1951 and 1952 and noting that often the people in that moment were talking about the ways in which the experience of the country at war was in Korea was different from the experience of the country at war that they had all just lived through recently. And I think that there's some continuities there, but a lot of contrasts that help us understand more about what this war was like and how it was different from the preceding conflict. Because our focus in the project as a whole is on untold stories, we'll spend a little time reflecting on Americans in groups whose stories have not traditionally been front and center. Tonight, I thought it would be interesting to consider a little bit religious minority groups. There are 150,000 Jewish soldiers who serve in the American armed forces during the Korean War. We'll talk very briefly about ways in which those kinds of community tried to preserve identity, even in the midst of a combat theater. In the upper right-hand corner, you see a photograph of the 213th Armored Field Artillery Battalion. They're a reserve unit out of Utah. And the US military did not send religious minority groups off to fight in segregated units, but because the 213th Armored Field Artillery Battalion was from Utah in 1950, a majority of those soldiers are members of the church, the LDS Church. And so they are going off as Mormons at war. We'll talk a little bit about the way faith communities affected soldiers' understanding of their own experiences. Most importantly, and closest to my own researcher's heart, we're going to talk a little bit about the experience of soldiers leaving the armed forces and coming back and transitioning into civilian life. And in particular, some of the challenges that leaving a combat theater and all the attendant deprivations and stresses and traumas that combat theater entailed, and making this transition back to civilian society and all the kind of challenges that created. And they're particularly interesting in the case of the Korean War because coming home from Korea felt very different to the veterans that we're covering than coming home from the Second World War felt to those veterans. I have to acknowledge I went down a couple of rabbit holes in the research for this webinar tonight. I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit about veterans' transitions and particularly some of the psychological strains that being in combat and then returning to peacetime life entailed. So those are the three things. We've got some great primary sources. We'll pause a few times to get some input and some analysis from you guys in the audience. But let's just dive right in. we've talked a lot about the kind of context of Korea and how the Cold War backdrop helps explain the kind of geopolitics that are in play in the early 1950s on the Korean Peninsula. But a lot of what we've talked about was fairly high level stuff, and some of it is based on documents that were not made public to the average American. So some of the documents that we looked at were still classified in 1950. And so I thought it would be interesting to go back to some of the more popular publications that are available to Americans in 1950 or 1951, and to just use something like Life magazine, which at the time was a massive circulation, glossy magazine covering all sorts of different facets of American life, and seeing what the average American magazine buyer was hearing about this conflict on the other side of the war as it was happening. And I found this article from December 1950, so just a few months into the war. We've got photojournalists and a little bit of text that are talking to the average American who, as you saw from the cover, might be picking up Life magazine to learn a little bit about Hollywood gossip. But here we've got an early story about the fate of American service members on the Korean Peninsula, and arguing that in the first few months, the military outcome is a hell of a beating. That there is a lot of explaining to do about why Americans had not acquitted themselves more successfully in the opening months of the Korean conflict. And again, this is running in one of the high circulation mass market publications. So there are little dollops and drips of information that are going out, even to Americans who are not actively seeking out news about geopolitics. We could go to magazines that are a little more substantive and that are targeting audiences that are interested in some more meaty examination of global geopolitics. So I picked up this copy of US News and World Report from October of 1951. And so the war has been going on for a little less than a year and a half. It is amazing doing historical research here in 2025. All of these US News and World Report magazines have been digitized. I was able to page through not just the things relevant to the Korean conflict, but all sorts of other things in this issue just to kind of see what Americans were reading about in 1951 as the conflict was raging. And I was really stunned to get to page 21 in this article, which describes Korea as the forgotten war. And I found that stunning just out of a realization that the war is still very much being fought. And to have a publication say this has been forgotten seemed a little bit surprising to me. I've gone ahead and transcribed most of that article. And I thought we could, as a group, take a quick look at what a slightly more highbrow publication is saying about the Korean War, again, to people who are half a world away, and what it is pointing out or highlighting as salient issues and how it is presenting the Korean conflict. So let's take a second. I was surprised that entire page of magazine text, it really breaks down to about 24 sentences. So even in the higher brow magazines, there's not, we're not talking about a dictionary's worth of information, but it has given, I think, a very specific critique of the Korean War. And I invite you to just skim over it and think about quickly what ideas are jumping out at you or what surprises you. And then second, what would you say is the tone of the article, or what kind of description of the Korean conflict is it presenting?
I think it's always really interesting when we look at media of the time, because I think that gives us a sense of the kinds of things that people are talking about. I think it's important to remember that just because you read something that was written in the past, it doesn't mean that everybody agreed with it. It doesn't mean that everybody disagreed with it, right? But it means that that's what people were chatting about. So we'd love, I know, I'll be quiet for a second.
No,
But
I love it. And it's very much, I think these are ideas. Again, this isn't a weekly or monthly magazine. So these are things that people might be discussing with coworkers or with family members. This stuff is very much out there. And again, remember the war in December of 1951, we don't know how it's going to turn out. If you just bought US News and World Report, you have no idea how much longer it's going to go or what the final outcome is going to be. So it's really interesting to take a peek at a snapshot of the kind of national discussion that's going on.
yeah, definitely. Go ahead into that Q&A box. What's
Okay.
standing out? And what's the tone? All right, Mrs. Turner, go for it. We've got some answers.
All right, we've got a few in here. One of our participants says it is kind of scary for families to read. Another stated the war almost sounds like it is worthy of the United States effort. We paid too much. Americans are dying. Big war rates and compared to World War II.
If I could just jump in there, I
Yeah.
love that acknowledgement of towards the bottom that they're making this deliberate comparison. Like what is, the frame of reference for Americans living through the Korean conflict, their natural tendency is to go back to World War II. And that last paragraph, if you haven't jumped down there already, the strange war is being paid for at big war rates. In the first 15 months, the cost in US casualties has been higher than the first 15 months of World War II. And I think the commenter was exactly right. I think the tone of this paragraph here is, what are we getting for this sacrifice? What kind of concrete American values are being defended or supported?
Another says one idea is that there were immense casualties, yet people in the US forgot about the war. This just reminds me that everything is all about perspective.
Two great observations. And I think, so I found this magazine back in the 90s when I was still in graduate school. And when I presented it to some undergraduates, they were shocked that Americans could, forget about a war that was actively being fought. In the last 20 years, the United States has been involved in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I have a lot of students now in my classes who are veterans of those wars, and they don't find this nearly as surprising. And a lot of them will say, I kind of felt forgotten over there. We didn't feel like we were front page news every day. And so perspective, what's happening in the moment, I think is absolutely critical to kind of understanding how Americans are trying to make sense of what's happening. One of the things that's useful in contrasting the conflict in Korea and the conflict that preceded it, the Second World War, is to think about the difference between what scholars refer to as limited war and other kinds of conflict. And most historians would argue that for the United States, the Korean conflict was a limited war. What do I mean by limited war? Well, limited war is usually defined by limited goals. The kind of outcomes that you are pursuing in a limited war are not the unconditional surrender of your opponent, but maybe some kind of reconquest of a particular piece of territory or access to a shipping lane. Limited in mobilization, that is the degree to which the entire society is being asked to participate and to sacrifice. And then limited means, the things that your nation is willing to do in pursuit of its goals are often limited. And so we've got a concept here that I think is really useful, particularly if you're thinking about the American experience in the Korean War, but is useful in thinking about the American experience at war generally over, 2.5 centuries, because most of the conflicts that the United States has participated in over the course of its history feel more like limited wars. The contrast with limited war is what scholars would refer to as a total war. And total wars are defined very, very much as the kind of contrast between limited wars. So the goals are unlimited. rather than trying to, retake a piece of territory or redraw a boundary on the map, you're often pursuing the complete destruction or capitulation of your opponent. The mobilization is unlimited. The way in which the population, the industrial infrastructure, the economy is harnessed to these goals is much more total. And then the means are often unlimited. That is, the things that the society is willing to do in pursuit of these goals are much more far-reaching. And for Americans in 1951 and 1952, they are all thinking about total war because they have a really close at hand example of what total war feels like. And that's the Second World War that virtually all of them had just lived through, in which the goals are unlimited. It is the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. The mobilization is almost unlimited. We've grown the American infrastructure and its industrial footprint dramatically. We've brought in workers who had not traditionally taken on certain kinds of jobs, women, Black Americans coming into the workforce. And then the means that the people and the government are willing to apply in pursuit of these goals have gotten much bigger. And I think the very clear example of that is the use of atomic weapons against Japan in August of 1945. Those are nearly unlimited tools of destruction, and they are justified in pursuit of these goals of total war, the total destruction of the fascist totalitarian systems of the Axis powers. And almost, any American who's more than 6 years old during the Korean conflict has lived through a total war and remembers viscerally what that feels like. Here you have the Blue Star banners that are ubiquitous in American households from 1942 to 1945. The Blue Star banners would hang in a front parlor or a front window, and each blue star represents a close family member who is serving abroad in the armed forces. And between 1942 and 1945, a walk down just about any street in the United States is going to reveal, dozens of these banners because so much of the population had been mobilized. And Americans, whether they're familiar with the definitions of total and limited war, the kind of collegiate professorial definitions, they have all lived through the total war of World War II. And so they understand what it feels like. They had lived through rationing. They had lived through sacrifice. They had lived through these government-sponsored advertising campaigns that had told them what the war was being fought for, why the war was necessary to defend and protect American interests. And if you take a look at that propaganda poster on the far right, they are Americans at home in World War II are often being told about the terrifying things that might happen should the United States lose the Second World War. And so we've got a great handy example for every American in the 1950s of what total war feels like. You all have become expert in the Korean conflict over the course of your research, and everyone here probably has at least some appreciation for the ways in which the American war effort on the Korean Peninsula from 1950 onwards just doesn't feel the same. It doesn't have these kind of unlimited goals. It doesn't have unlimited mobilization. We've talked a lot about the Truman Doctrine, which is a really important watershed moment in American foreign policy. It's critical in setting a course for American military power for the next 50 years. It becomes central to defining the Cold War, but it does not speak in terms of unconditional surrender. It is the president stating that the policy of the United States will be to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities. We must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own ways. And while that is a kind of aspirational language, it also doesn't tell you when this job will be finished, what the victory conditions will look like. It is a kind of open-ended commitment to do something in any place in which free peoples are resisting outside subjugation. There can be no moment under the Truman Doctrine where the enemy is dragged to the deck of the USS Missouri and forced to sign an instrument of surrender. And so we've got a kind of vague, open-ended promise about what American military power is going to do, but not a kind of total idea that, you know, at this point, we will drag our opponents to the surrender table and force them to give up completely. Americans reading Life magazine get reinforcements that, you know, this war is not like the previous war. And so if you're picking up Life to learn a little bit more about your favorite Hollywood stars, in this same issue, you're also going to trip over this article that asks a kind of pointed rhetorical question: what mobilization? You know, what is the United States doing in order to put war materiel and equipment in the hands of soldiers on the Korean Peninsula? And this is, again, December of 1950. So the war has been waging for less than half a year. There is nothing like this during the Second World War, because everyone can see the ways in which the American industrial infrastructure has been mobilized and harnessed to the kind of single-minded purpose of victory. By 1945, 70% of American workers are working directly for the government in a war job. And a majority of those who are not are working indirectly for the war effort by working at a supplier who is producing things that go on to a war factory. And Americans know what it felt like to be in a country that had been mobilized totally for war. And here we've got Life magazine pointing out how different this is. It is a limited war, limited goals, limited mobilization. And we've seen gestures towards that in a few of our political cartoons, right? That the rocky road to nowhere, where we've got UN peacekeepers kind of crawling on hands and knees over all of these difficulties, attempting to get to a place that they can never get to by definition, to me kind of encapsulates the frustration of this open-ended promise of supporting freedom-loving peoples, but with no defined end date, and the difficulty of doing that in a context in which the country is not willing to use every tool at its disposal. The other thing to keep in mind that is defining about limited wars and about the Korean War in particular is that the means are limited. The United States in 1950 possesses all sorts of technologies, particularly military technologies, that it is very reluctant to use in the Korean War for a number of reasons. And one of the most important is probably that Cold War context. The atomic bombs that had been dropped at the end of the Second World War demonstrated the incredible power of this new destructive technology. The United States has a smallish arsenal of atomic weapons by the time of the Korean War, and there are certainly voices inside the military and the government and outside who are suggesting that the United States ought to be using atomic technologies to help advance its fortunes on the Korean Peninsula. But there is that Cold War backdrop that the Soviet bloc also has atomic weapons, and that Russia might respond to an American use of atomic weapons on the Korean Peninsula by retaliating in kind, and that very quickly that kind of retaliation, eye for an eye, might get out of hand. And this political cartoon that shows the powder keg of World War III sitting on the Korean Peninsula, I think speaks very directly to that fear. We're also seeing a big break from the sort of traditional way that the American home front apportions money for its defense between the end of World War II and Korea. And here in this graph, the important line to look at is the red one. For almost all of its history, all the way back into the 19th century, Americans have tried to keep military spending very low at peacetime, and they have kept a military that is maybe a little smaller than some people have argued they should in the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And Americans have decided that they will pay large amounts of treasure in the event of a military emergency. And you can see a big spike there for the First World War. You can see that huge spike in the Second World War. But something different happens as we get to 1950, which is military spending begins to climb back up. And after the Korean War ends in an armistice, it will not drop back down. And so this is the moment in which the American military budget for keeping an expensive standing army in peacetime is really going to begin to stick. And Americans are thinking about that at home, the costs of these military conflicts, what it means to mobilize their society for them. And all of this is changing. That's really what history is. It's the study of change over time. I found these Gallup polls absolutely fascinating. So we've got a series of public opinion polls that are being taken between July of 1950, which is when the Korean conflict begins, going all the way to April of 1952. And I want to draw your attention to the fourth one. Do you think the United States made a mistake in going to war in Korea or not? Now remember, the war is barely a year old, and here a majority, a bare majority, but a majority are saying the United States should not have gone to war in Korea. And that to me just speaks to the kind of not confusion, but the contentiousness of following the Truman Doctrine, trying to contain communism in a place most Americans hadn't heard of. And there's a huge contrast there in my mind with the kinds of things that we're seeing during the Second World War, in which there is much more universal popular support for the war. It's a thing that needs to be done, and everyone has a role to play.
Dr. Hamner, can I interrupt for a minute? We've
You
got a
sure
question
can.
in the Q&A. It says, just curious, what did the other half of that spending graph look like?
The other half of this graph, you mean from 1960 to, yeah, I can show it to you. I edited it out only to simplify things. It will continue its upward trend with a couple of spikes such that we get the military budget that we're all kind of familiar with from political news today. You know, the American military is the most professional and the most developed in the history of planet Earth. It's highly technological, it's highly professionalized, and it's very expensive. Americans had never, until Korea, kind of gotten used to the idea of a standing expensive army in peacetime. That was something the founding generation really pushed hard against. This is the moment that we see it. And it's so you can go all the way back to the post-Korean War to kind of better understand how we got to where we are today. One thing that comes up in this discussion of limited war and came up just this last fall when I was teaching undergraduates, I had a very sharp student sitting in the back. And as I was introducing the idea of limited war, she put her hand right up and said, but people are fighting and they're dying. And how can that be limited in any way? And I want to emphasize that when we're talking about limited war and total war, we're talking at the societal level, right? We're talking about the degree to which an entire nation is mobilized. But my student was quite right that for the individual soldier, for their families at home, there's no limited to the war. The war feels all-encompassing. It is the focus of their fears, their aspirations, and I think that's important to picture too, that the number of people who go off to fight the Korean conflict is not as total as in World War II, but for those families, for the soldiers that you're researching, it is their entire world for that period. I tumbled down a couple of rabbit holes, as I often do when I get excited about learning more about soldiers' lives. And I spent a little time kind of digging into the Jewish experience at war, which is really fascinating. There's 150,000 Jewish soldiers who serve in the United States military during the Korean conflict. And as I said at the top, they're not sent off in, special, all Jewish units. But it's interesting to go back and look at their experiences and the ways in which often Jewish soldiers within units would begin to kind of, come together to share, worship, to share particular spiritual rites, or just to build a sense of community. That kind of identity is really valuable, sustaining their willingness to keep fighting, and to link them back home. This is a great primary source that I discovered in a American Jewish history historical site that is the Passover Seder from 1952 being celebrated in Seoul in South Korea. And it's really interesting to go back, I think, to any faith community, but particularly smaller faith communities, the way in which identity can become, really, really important and useful in focusing experience. The members of the LDS Church who go off as part of, a statewide reserve unit have a similar experience. And I noted in my research here that it's not, I haven't like delved deeply enough into this to say anything definitive, but kind of anecdotal examples, suggest that these kinds of, religious belief provide a really useful framework for soldiers in those communities and a way of understanding their experience. I've, in the course of my research since I was a graduate student, I think I've read somewhere between 40 and 50,000 soldier letters. And so I can tell you definitively that that old adage, there are no atheists in a foxhole, is definitely not true. There are certainly atheists that you can find in foxholes. But I also noticed a sort of tendency in a couple of the anecdotes that I researched for this webinar of people from, these close-knit faith communities using that framework, particular stories from their religious texts or particular references that they would say, this is who we are. We are much like this group from one of our holy books, and we are experiencing something not unlike, our predecessors hundreds or thousands of years ago. So if you've got a veteran that you're researching who has, who comes from a faith community like this, that might be something that you ponder on for just a little bit and see if there is anything in their experience that you can see that is helping them kind of organize or make sense of the experiences that they're having as they go off to war. The Korean War, unlike the Second World War, ends not in, a unconditional surrender of the opponent, but in a truce, an uneasy armistice that remains in place. So here we've got the 1953 Cincinnati Enquirer headline, which talks about the end of the Korean conflict, and then President Dwight Eisenhower's warning that it was not time to relax. And this too feels just very different from the experiences at the end of the Second World War, a more total conflict with more total goals, and a willingness to use all of the available means and in order to achieve those goals. And here in Korea in 1953, we get something that just feels unresolved in a way that the war in the Pacific did not. So we've got a great political cartoon here. It's a pretty simple, I think the humor of it is pretty straightforward. But let me suggest you take a second to just make sure that you get the nature of the joke. And then let's do something not unlike what we did with the US News and World Report article and talk a little bit about the tone, because people looking at this political cartoon in 1953 might have a copy of the US News and World Report or Life magazine from 2 or 3 years previous sitting out in their garage. So what's the nature of the humor first? And then what is the sort of tone of the cartoon?
I love when we look at these political cartoons. I always used to tell my students that a political cartoon is a statement of political opinion. You might agree with it, you might disagree with it, but you got to figure out the opinion first before you can make your decision on it.
They're really good places to kind of practice your historical thinking too, because of exactly what you said, Ms. O'Hara. Like you've got to get the joke first. You've got to do the interpretation first, and then you can start peeling back the layers and seeing what's underneath it.
We've got one answer. We want to get a couple in here. What's the nature of the joke? And then what's the tone of the cartoon?
I sometimes have to remind my undergraduates that joke is maybe a little different in political cartooning. You know, that it's not a Saturday Night Live sketch or, you know, like a TikTok video that's designed to get you laughing out loud. Like the humor is usually pointed and often, you know, involves irony or sarcasm or kind of tweaking, you know, the other side's political views, kind of pointing out hypocrisy.
It's like we've got a couple ideas starting to come in. Don't be shy here. Uh, we've got an interesting observation. It's interesting to see that it looks like no one won. Remember that 38th parallel, that's the line that divided the 200 at the beginning and at the end.
I
Right,
do
you've
have
got
a
to
question. Somebody is asking, are those words at the top part of the cartoon or added by someone else?
Yeah, that is the title of the cartoon, and so I see this a lot in the original art, where the artist has handwritten in the title of the cartoon that will later be typeset when it appears in the newspaper.
We've got another observation that the animals look pretty rough and beat up. A little bit worse for
That's
the wear.
yeah, we've got a vulture and a bear. The bear's actually now see has got like a knot coming out of his head, so they're a little worse for the wear. But I love this observation, the first comment about, you know, who won or what is it that we won? Because we've found ourselves at war for 3 years. The US News and World Report article said we're paying big war prices. What did we get for all of that sacrifice, for the blood and treasure that's sacrificed? We are more or less right back where we started. And I think there's a kind of maybe frustration that is coming through this cartoon, or a weariness or a sense of disillusionment that there have been Americans fighting on the Korean Peninsula, and that they have been paying, you know, in personal and family levels, you know, a staggering price to simply get us back to where we started.
Can I ask a question based on one of the answers in here? Can you talk a little bit about who the bird is supposed to represent? Because there's been a couple questions of who exactly that bird is supposed to stand for.
Well, so the vulture is labeled Korean Reds, and so I'm thinking that's just the communist North Koreans. Being supported by, you know, their Russian advisors. I think it's significant that advisors is in quotation marks and scare quotes to suggest that maybe they're not simply advisors. But reds, and the color red, is used incredibly frequently in the 1950s and 1960s to denote communists. And so this is the Korean Reds are our communist opponents, who are being supported primarily not by the Russians at this point, but by the Chinese.
Well, and think too, it's a vulture, right? So
Yeah.
vultures are scavengers, they're kind of ugly
Right.
birds, but they're also, you know, they go after the things that are already dead or dying.
Right.
It's not a compliment to be called a vulture, right?
Yeah,
So
it's yeah, I mean, I think it's a cartoon. The more I look at it, the more I think it's talking a little bit about disillusionment or disappointment, or a kind of sense of bitterness. And since I've got so much else, let me keep moving. Just to contrast that sense of bitterness or disillusionment or disappointment with what Americans had experienced in 1945 at the end of World War II, right? There is no confusion about who won or what the United States had won. This is the celebration in New York City's Times Square following VJ Day, the victory over Japan. Like, there is nobody there who is questioning American victory or the value of American success in World War II. And that's just really different from how this end of the Korean conflict feels, that it's an armistice, we can't let our guards down, and people are pointing out, we spent 3 years, and all of these lives and all of this money to kind of get ourselves back to where we were when the war started. Korean War soldiers, like their predecessors in World War II, are going to start coming home as the war ends. And there are some continuities and some changes here as well. So the Second World War saw the beginning of large-scale social programs that were designed to ease veterans back into civilian life. That's the famous GI Bill, which provides job training and mortgage assistance and all sorts of supports that are designed to help these young men who had been at war in many cases for a year, 2 years, 3 years, come back and be members of productive society. The GI Bill is one of the biggest pieces of social legislation in the 20th century United States. It is, I think, almost universally thought of in really warm terms and held in high regard. And there will be something similar for Korean War veterans. So the veterans who are coming back from the Korean Peninsula will also be entitled to GI Bill benefits. This is the August 1952 Army Times reports. And I want to just draw your attention to the middle part here, which talks to people who are not yet coming home about what kinds of benefits their military service is going to entitle them to. Education and training, loans to buy homes or businesses, unemployment compensation when necessary, mustering out money, that is cash payments upon leaving the service, and finally, job finding assistance. So the government is going to do a terrific amount to help veterans who had been off to war for the previous months or years reintegrate into civilian society. And I think there are two things going on here. One of them is the very real, I think, profound obligation that the country has to help the people who have served and fought and suffered in national defense. Like you owe those people something upon their return. And there's also this concern, I think, about what might happen if we didn't provide, 21, 22, 23-year-old young men who might have had their civilian lives very rudely interrupted. They've been sent off into a traumatic and violent experience for the last few years. And what if we just, took away their uniforms and dropped them off in Poughkeepsie and said, you're on your own? Like that might not be great for the social fabric either. And so this idea that it is best for everyone if veterans are given government support to help reintegrate. And one of the things that interests me the most as somebody who's been thinking about the psychological experience of soldiers for a quarter of a century now is the psychological experience of coming home from war. And I think this might be really helpful as you're thinking about writing up this part of your veterans experience, is thinking about the soldiers who are coming home with the invisible wounds of service. So the traumas and the psychological challenges of having spent a few years of very impressionable young life in circumstances that are often, really horrifying and excruciatingly traumatic. We have a lot of pictures from the Korean conflict of soldiers who are in combat theaters who are beginning to show signs of psychological breakdown. We see that in the Korean War, and the United States government actually knows about the trauma inherent in sending young men off to fight. Again, we've got this great, useful example from 1942 to 1945. This is the title card from a 1946 documentary called Let There Be Light. It's by the Hollywood director John Huston. It is available on YouTube, and I cannot recommend it highly enough if you're interested in learning about transitions. Huston had been commissioned by the US government to do a documentary that looked at men who are coming home physically intact from the Second World War, but who were suffering from mental traumas. And what he and his film crew did was set up cameras and simply let them run as returning veterans talked with doctors and staff about what they had seen and what they had done and how it had changed them. It is to my, I mean, I can't think of an earlier example of what we would now call like reality programming. They just let the cameras run as people are having conversations. They shoot 375,000 feet of film, which is more than 70 hours. They condense that down to about an hour, and you get examples of men talking in really nakedly open ways about what going to war was like and how it has stuck with them. It's absolutely fascinating.
Dr. Hamner,
Yes.
we have a question in the Q&A
Okay.
about the GI benefits.
Okay.
The participant is asking, were the GI Bill benefits available for all Korean War veterans, or were underrepresented service members kept from some of those opportunities?
Can I loop back to that in the Q&A?
You bet.
Fantastic. I just want to spend a little more time talking about the psychological breakdown here. So the Army is kind of aware that returning soldiers are often bringing with them the traumas of battle, and they have some ideas about what they might do to help treat it. Fascinatingly, the internal studies suggested that people who were recorded for this film actually responded better to treatment than people who weren't. So having a camera on you actually made you more open to treatment. The Army commissions this film. They hire a big time Hollywood director to make it. He shoots the footage, cuts it together in 1946, and then the Army shelves it and does not allow it to be released to the public. And my students in undergraduate classes always ask why, and the answer is really simple, that military brass were concerned that seeing these discussions about the trauma that soldiers endured in combat was going to hurt military recruiting. There was an awareness that we're going to need soldiers for the Cold War. The Korean conflict has started. We cannot put a big documentary that has people weeping and breaking down and talking about how the experience of combat has broken them. And so the film stays, in the vault until the 1980s. But you can go see it now, and I can't recommend it enough. And what the Army's own internal studies in the 1950s and decades after suggest that soldiers in the Korean War experience very similar kinds of combat traumas to their predecessors in World War II. And in some cases, the combat traumas seem to be a little more acute because of the extremity of the circumstances. So we talked a little bit about the blisteringly cold conditions in that Korean winter, with temperatures going down, into the well below zero, with wind chills that I've seen like in the minus 80s. And combat trauma and psychological breakdown is a complex thing that involves interactions between the physical body and the psyche. And we have some evidence that, as you're exposed to more, bodily trauma in cold weather or hot weather, that it becomes even more difficult to deal with these psychological symptoms. And the pictures that you can find of Korean War veterans are often very distinctively kind of have the external symptoms that we would much later come to refer to as post-traumatic stress, the 1,000-yard stare, which I think you're kind of seeing here, people who are experiencing flashbacks, insomnia, dissociative episodes, like all things that will become very common in the latter part of the 20th century. But remember, post-traumatic stress does not become a diagnosis until 1980. So your veterans or people they served with are experiencing these symptoms, but maybe don't have a way to talk about them. And that's one of the things that I find achingly tragic about this, that there is not a vocabulary for talking about these kinds of symptoms. This is a 2019 study on Korean War veterans and their experiences with PTSD. And I found this part absolutely heartbreaking, that they received suboptimal or no mental health treatment for decades. And so we've got soldiers coming back from the Korean War conflict, affected by these traumas in ways big and small, and simply not being able to get adequate mental health care. History is the study of change over time. It's not as if the veterans, the VA like loses interest in these people. And I was very interested to find this article from 2021 that shows ways in which the VA is still looking for ways to help address the kinds of symptoms that people had experienced decades prior. So it's a kind of ongoing, evolving effort. One thing that I think made a lot of those symptoms more acute and made it more difficult for soldiers coming back from the Korean War is they were aware of what they weren't getting. You know, they had watched older brothers or uncles or fathers come back from World War II, to ticker tape parades and to the huge adulation of American society generally. And that is just not something that Korean War veterans get on anything like the same scale. And I think it's really interesting. In 1985, Gallup did a survey about the degree to which veterans of those two conflicts felt appreciated. Over 70% of World War II veterans said they felt appreciated, that society had thanked them adequately for what they did. Only 33% of Korean War veterans said the same. So you've got just a really significant gap, even though the two events are separated by only a few years. History is the study of change over time. It's not as if the book is closed on appreciating Korean War veterans at any particular moment. And I think in a lot of ways, the project that we're all engaged in here is about showing that appreciation, about taking an interest in foregrounding these stories. In the 1950s, soldiers coming back from the Korean War conflict are watching monuments and statues and memorials go up to World War II. There are not a lot of Korean War monuments going up at that moment, but that's going to start to change. In 1987, we get this bench of thoughtful remembrance in the Arlington Cemetery that highlights the sacrifice of Korean War veterans. In 1995, we get the National Korean War Memorial, which is a fascinating, very moving monument on the National Mall. And I know that we're running over, but just really quickly, if you've been there or just looking at the pictures, take a second in the Q&A box to reflect on what stands out to you about the choices in this monument. I can already see Ms. O'Hara and Ms. Turner kind of looking at me because they know I love talking about monuments and memorials. I never get tired of it. But what stands out to you if you're taking a look at this set of statues as a war memorial? Kind of what are the choices that you see, and what are the what is the kind of tone or vision of the Korean War that you get?
I'll mention, if you ever have the opportunity to see this memorial at night, it's a very different experience than
Yeah.
seeing it during the day.
The Korean War Memorial, I think, is one of the only memorials I've ever visited. It's different if you go during the day than if you go at night. It's different if you go in the summer than if you go in the winter. I mean, no matter when you go, the memorial kind of changes, which is, I think, kind of unusual. It is bitter cold this week here in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to try to go down there this weekend just because I think it's a very different experience if you're down there when the wind is whipping across the mall. What are we getting in the Q&A?
Got some comments in the chat here. We saw this monument in the evening when there was a layer of fog among the soldiers, and as you came up, you saw the three-dimensional faces in the wall. It was spooky. It feels like they're in the field, but it's isolating. Seeing it at dusk is eerily beautiful. The toils of war and the difficulties of the war theater, sadness.
So good. Yeah, I think that the difficulties, the toil, the exhaustion, the kind of fatigue of it, if you look at the soldier figures, you can kind of see them staggering under the weight. It's really different than like the World War II Memorial, which is further down the mall, which has a sense of power and triumph. And this is just a different vision. It's of war as a slog, sort of isolating, and you very much see the kind of reality of war in the faces here, which is something that not every war memorial captures or even tries to capture. Um, I'll note too, that this process of commemoration, the book is not closed. So we talked briefly about those LDS soldiers. In 2021, a local monument to their service and their sacrifice went up in Cedar City, Utah. And so there is no moment at which you say we are done commemorating this conflict. And I think one of the great things about the Korean War, which is noted as the forgotten war, even as it's going on, is that it is becoming a little bit more remembered. Last point before we do Q&A is just to mention one thing that I think is incredibly important. We haven't talked very much about this Korean civilians' experience in this conflict, and that's fine. That's not really what this project is about. It's not the kind of research we're trying to do, but I think in any time we're studying a war, we want to at least acknowledge the wide variety of perspectives and the wide variety of lives that it touches, and the destructive toll. There are 3 million dead Korean civilians on the peninsula between 1950 and 1953. And the lingering after effects of this war will go on for decades. My father was stationed in Korea from November of 1963 to the spring of 1965. And he said even 10 years later, you could very clearly see the damage to the social fabric wide open. I am going to put up that big slide, hand things over to Lynn, and then sit tight here for some Q&A. And we've already got one question in the queue, which I will take as soon as Lynn wraps up our business.
All right. Well, you know the drill. Fill out your survey, give us the feedback, but also make sure that that gives us the information that we use, not only as we're looking at this, but also looking to future years and cohorts to say, hey, how can we make this program the best that it can possibly be? So either use your phone, take a quick snapshot, or tinyurl.com/nhd-kw-live. And if you can't remember that, it's in Google Classroom. We use the same form every single time. That's intentional. All right, we are going to jump to some Q&A, but I know that some people will need to head out, and that's fine. We'll keep recording and we'll post it tomorrow. But I wanted to see really quickly, I'm going to put him on the spot, to see if Dr. Melnick has anything he'd like to say as we wrap with our students and teachers, and as they shift from the research phase into the process where they're going to be writing, analyzing, but then also visiting the cemeteries this spring.
You are putting me on the spot, Lynn, but I've really enjoyed working with some of the teachers who've had questions that I've been able to answer by doing a little bit of research or interpretation on the documents. I look forward to seeing at least one of these classes as I go out to one of our cemeteries. But in the interest of everybody's time, since we're over time, I'll leave it at that. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you. We went a little over, but we had some really good discussions, and that's worth 8 minutes of everybody's time. All right, we've got at least 2 really good questions in the queue. We'll start with that. Please feel free to put questions in. If you have questions about this, if you have questions about what's coming up or next steps, or need us to go over anything, we're happy to do that. All right. Looks like the first question's for you, Dr. Hamner.
I will start with the GI Bill question,
GI Bill
but I would like to preface my response by just apologizing for running over. You guys know I get really excited and I often run over my mark. So GI Bill question is a great one because if you know much about the end of World War II, you know that the benefits are supposed to be broadly shared, but they are structured such that certain groups, particularly Black veterans of the Second World War, are not brought in to share in the bounties at the same level. And the law can't be written in a way that says, if you're not white, you don't get these things, because that won't pass 14th Amendment muster. But in World War II, the GI Bill can be structured to say, if you don't serve in particular combat capacities, you get lesser benefits, and that happens to break along racial lines. As we've seen in the Korean War, a big part is the desegregation of the army and allowing soldiers of different races and different categories to participate in the fighting, to participate in the combat arms. And so the GI Bill benefits are shared, as I understand it, much more broadly and fairly. But the returning cohort is correspondingly smaller than the World War II cohort. It's really significant because one of the things that economic historians are discovering as they go back and study the last 75 years of American history, that those GI Bill benefits are incredibly important in getting people a leg up into the middle class. And so it is not simply a thank you for a job well done, but it is also a ticket to a kind of stable, productive life in the middle class. And that means if the law is written in ways that are either de jure or de facto, involve segregation, that's materially affecting the chances and opportunities that different smaller groups have.
Can I jump on the second question? Because this is something that's come up in a lot of the files that we've looked at. Many of the veterans, and maybe it's just the luck of this group, they served active duty for a year, sometimes 2 years, sometimes longer, but then are reassigned to reserve units to finish out their period of service, whether it's another year, 2 years, 3 years, depends on the person. Were a lot of soldiers returned and placed into reserve units after service in the Korean War?
Dr. Melnick, do you want to speak to that?
I don't know the exact numbers. I do know that in many cases, if you volunteered for the Army and you had, say, a 5-year enlistment, and you served in the Korean War for 2 years, then the remainder of that enlistment you weren't released from, you were placed in the reserves. What's important to know is there are two broad categories of reserve. There's the inactive reserve, which placed no requirements on the individual to continue to do any kind of military training. And there's what's called the active reserve or the selected reserve. That's your National Guard and Army Reserve and stuff, where you would drill on weekends and do an annual training in the summer. Following World War II, a great many of the soldiers who were demobilized were placed in the inactive reserve. And we saw this in the case of the one soldier from Puerto Rico that I was asked to look into. He was recalled from the inactive reserve by the Army, almost certainly involuntarily. And if you read about the history of the Korean War and about the soldiers' stories, I'm sure Dr. Hamner has come across this. There's a lot of bitterness amongst World War II veterans who were recalled to serve in the Korean War, where there were plenty of 18 and 19-year-old young people in America who had never fought in World War II who were not drafted. So there's that sentiment that goes on. But so I imagine the same was true in the Korean War, but I don't have facts at my fingertips that a lot of the folks who were released from service after spending a year or so in Korea would have been placed in the inactive reserve to serve up the remainder of their tour of duty.
Well, and keep an eye out.
I don't have the figures, but what Dr. Melnick has said tracks completely with my experience researching. And the one thing I might draw your attention to is just the way in which this kind of signals a tectonic shift in the way that America is going to maintain its armed forces. Prior to the end of World War II, after every huge conflict, the Army shrinks back down to a tiny little skeleton outfit. By 1950, we've decided we're going to commit ourselves to containing communism. We might need a large military at any point. We might need to grow the military quickly. And so keeping reserve units, active or inactive, people who know something about military life and can be recalled at a moment's notice is a huge shift in the way that Americans think about national defense.
Okay, we've got another question in the queue here. How much information is there for those who were stationed on ships and submarine support?
Dr. O'Hara, do you want to take that one or do you want me to start?
I want you to start, Ms. O'Hara,
right.
because I am a dry land kind of military historian.
Well, I think when we start talking specifically about those serving in the Navy, we have to shift the way we research, right? Because we're not necessarily going to find so much about that person by name. But what we do is we start to research the ship. We start to research the campaign they're involved in and where they move around the world. That's the thing. What's magical about if you're researching someone who served in the Navy or the Marine Corps is the muster rolls. Remember, every month the Navy essentially took roll. So who was on the ship, who had been sent off the ship for training or maybe to go on leave, who was receiving medical care at a certain hospital, and then all the Navy units do this every month. You can search by name for your person on Ancestry. If they serve right, you're going to find a lot of them, right? There could be as much as, 12 of these every year. My suggestion, get them, print them out, and then put them in time order. Oftentimes you can trace your sailors from where they receive training to if they go to any kind of specialized school training, but then what ship they're on and if they transfer ships. And then once you know the ship information, then you're able to research to see where they are. And I will tell you, my go-to place for studying the Navy is Naval History and Heritage Command. They have so much digitized. They have lots of good stuff. And if you get stuck, reach out for me. I've got a friend over there. And he's one of those people where if he can't find it, it doesn't exist. So I'm happy to reach out to help you get connection if there's a couple missing pieces that are there.
Let me throw out one more suggestion too, and what Ms. O'Hara said about, you're thinking about the ship as a unit rather than the individual sailors aboard is absolutely true. And in fact, military historians will talk about, the men are fighting the ship. One thing that's come to my attention through one of my graduate students is a great primary source that may be useful for you depending on where your sailor was assigned, is a kind of primary source called the cruise book, which he brought to me. Just basically like a yearbook. It looks like a high school yearbook that covers a particular ship for a particular year. And so once you know where your sailor was, you might see if you can find the cruise book, because it will have pictures, like yearbook pictures of everybody on there, but then it will also have things that they did, places they went, they threw a party or they had a bowling league or whatever. They're fascinating, and they're fascinatingly weird kinds of books. The ones that I have in my office are mostly from the Vietnam era, but there are some from the Korean War era. I like to poke around an archive called eBay when I'm looking for this kind of stuff, because sometimes you'll find someone selling a 1950 or 1960s vintage cruise book there. It will not have like long diary entries from your particular service member, but you'll at least get a sense of what kind of life aboard this particular vessel was like, and maybe a sense, what that class was like. It can be really eye-opening if you can find one.
Like they also contain maps, like where they started January 1st, kind of, and then different ports of call. So those can be really interesting sources as well. Can I just toss out one other? Go ahead, Dr. Melnick.
I was just going to add that it's actually, at least online right now, easier to research folks in the Navy because a lot of these muster rolls have been digitized and can be found on Ancestry or on the Fold 3 part of Ancestry. The Army equivalent of that kind of a ship's roster are what they would call the day books. Those things exist, but not in digitized format. You've got to go to College Park. You've got to go pay Lynn a visit in College Park at the Archives 2 facility to glimpse of those sort of day books that were kept from World War II and so on. So the Army
You got to bring a pick and a shovel too.
Yeah, it's very true. But the Navy's actually easier to do that online. That's kind of neat. And where the Army piece comes into that is if, as we found with one of the soldiers we were looking at just recently, if a soldier gets on a Navy ship to be transported somewhere, their name will be written down on that ship's manifest. And those kinds of things have been scanned in and can be found. So that's all.
Excellent. And we've got a comment in the Q&A. Meg says her father was a submariner. He has t-shirts on the boats he started that men design. So oftentimes they'll have like inside jokes or comments about what's going on in the world or political comments. Those kind of unofficial souvenirs man, sometimes you get lucky and a family member will open it and will bring a box or a suitcase or a trunk, and man, there's so many neat things that.
If
that
you
go
can
into
find
this
something
thing.
like that, they are priceless because you get a sense of like the flavor of that experience in a way that you don't always get from official documents. So one of my graduate students brought me a cruise book from the USS Hamner as a kind of gift for being for advising his project, and I was fascinated. You know, I didn't know there was a USS Hamner, but also just like, wow, there's they had a luau here, and like in the middle of a combat zone, they were, you know, they did this thing or this unusual thing. And you kind of like, much like flipping through a high school yearbook, you're like, oh, I kind of have a sense of what it was like in Toledo in 1971 or whatever.
Excellent. Well, I also want to throw out one other thing in reference to the things that you were talking about mental illness and trauma. I know that some of our veterans struggled when they came home. Some may have, you know, had addictions to alcohol or drugs or gotten involved in some less than legal activities. And I think that this helps give us a little bit of empathy, right? We may not have liked the behavior, but I think we have a little bit of understanding that oftentimes these are outward signs of coping mechanisms. Not the best coping mechanisms, but ones that are part of the story. So we want to make sure that we're honest, but also empathetic and understanding that these are people and these are their stories.
Yeah, and as somebody who's been thinking about this for, you know, a long time and been thinking about post-traumatic stress in the 18th century, the 19th century, and the 20th century, I'm all empathy now, particularly because of, you know, that line in that report that these men come back. Remember, at very impressionable ages, they have been exposed to some very difficult things. And then they are brought home and they are given almost nothing in the way of mental health counseling. And if you are experiencing nightly disruptions in your sleep because of flashbacks, if you are having uncontrollable rage that you cannot seem to understand, and you are offered nothing in the way of counseling or any outside help, there's a lot of alcohol use and alcohol use disorder among this generation of veterans, and I see that as attempts to self-medicate, right? That's how you get to sleep if there is nothing else that you can do, or like that is a thing that maybe you know, it's a crude and I think really misguided effort to manage symptoms. And yet these are 23, 24-year-old young men who do not understand what's going on in their own heads, who do not understand and are given no tools to make sense of this. The fact that veterans gravitate to things like the VFW or the American Legion, where they kind of create versions of support groups, which are just trading stories with other people who have been through similar experiences. You know, they happen to often do that while they're drinking, and there are all sorts of behaviors that we now would say are problematic because they're not really treating the root cause. But in the absence of getting actual useful support from any outside entity, it makes all the sense in the world for me that people are trying to self-medicate. They're trying to give themselves some sort of quiet. They're reacting to these violent traumatic experiences they've had in the ways that broken people often do. And so I'm like all empathy for that experience, having read, you know, hundreds and hundreds of letters and experiences about people who are experiencing symptoms that don't even have a name yet, right? Post-traumatic stress is not going to go in the DSM until 1980.
I think we have to extend that empathy also to their families, right? Their spouses, their children, their siblings, their parents, who they don't often aren't equipped with the tools either. And I think that maybe gives us some insight into their lives. We never want to make assumptions about people in the past because we don't know, right? We don't know what they were thinking at any point in time unless they wrote it down or said it to us. But I do think it lets us think in a little more of an empathetic way, because I think an important piece of doing this work is developing what we call historical empathy, looking at the past in different ways, considering stories, and maybe looking at people in the past with a little less judgment and a little more, wow, that must have been complicated, or that must have been hard, or maybe I need to think about things in a different way or from a different perspective. So thank you for bringing that into the story as well. I think that's going to be very helpful for some of our teams.
One more plug for the Let There Be Light video, which is if you want to humanize the experience of veterans, albeit World War II veterans, not Korean War veterans, but get a kind of glimpse of how people are understanding this thing, this set of symptoms. It is riveting, and the amount of empathy and genuine care that they are receiving is remarkable and really eye-opening. And then you think how tragic that this thing got put on the shelf and prevented from going out into a wider audience where it might have done some real good. But seeing veterans come back and breaking down as they try to tell the stories of what they've seen and what they've done and what they've been exposed to it will grab you right in the heart and just hold you for an hour.
All right, well, we are pushing at our max time limit, but these were some excellent questions and really great discussion tonight. Thank you so much to Dr. Melnick and the team from the National Cemetery Administration for all the ways they've supported this program and the teachers and students. Thank you for your time and your effort. We look forward to seeing your work and transitioning you into the next phase of the project. Last but not least, please talk to us, reach out if you need help, if you're starting to get frustrated, if you're just not sure how to do something. Please reach out, give us times. I promise Mrs. Turner will hop on a call. I'll hop on a call. I'll get Dr. Hamner or Dr. Melnick on a call, depending on the questions you have. And we're here to support you and see you through the last phase of this project to honor the veterans that you've put so much time and care into. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap for this evening and stop our